at San Diego State University. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree from Princeton University in 1995 and coordinated her PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from UC Berkeley in 2006. Broadly, her research focuses on interactions between humans and the environment, community engagement in managing and governing natural resources, and social and ecological vulnerabilities, the effects of climate change. But recently, her research has gleaned knowledge and best practices to enhance climate adaptation in fisheries, as well as engaging fishermen's perspective on management and constraint within California fisheries. Arielle serves as the director of the sustainability major at San Diego State, which aims to equip students to tackle complex environmental problems and provide solutions that meet the needs of social, political, biological, and economic stakeholders within communities. Professionally, she serves as an editorial board member for the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy, a science advisory team member for California Ocean Protection Council, and as a member of the Social Science Working Group for NOAA's Cooperative Science Center for Earth System Science and Remote Sensing Technologies. Please help me welcome Arielle Levine as she explores success in fisheries management in the context of climate change, fishermen perspectives on factors of enable or inhibit climate adaptation.
All right, can you hear me or do I need to unmute? Unmute. Can you hear me now? Awesome, okay. This was explained to me and I already forgot, so thank you. And thank you very much for having me. It's truly an honor to be invited to be part of the Bevan seminar series or lecture series here. So I'm very much appreciative. I was told that the Bevan theme this year is what does success look like and how do we get there? From the perspective of sustainable fisheries, or in regards to sustainable fisheries. So I thought I would, for the purposes of my talk, define success as adaptation to climate change and what this means from the perspective of fishermen. So I'll be presenting on some work we've done exploring climate adaptation in the California market squid and spiny lobster fisheries in California. So we all know that ocean and coastal systems are changing as a consequence of global climate change, and that as these systems change, the people who rely on them also need to adapt to these changes. So as a social scientist who's interested in how to manage marine resources successfully in a changing climate, I focus on how people and governance systems are adapting to change, since ultimately to adapt, we need to change individual and institutional behavior. So I look at questions like how do resource-dependent communities adapt both now and in the future? What are potential strategies for adaptation? What are barriers to adaptation? And how can managers facilitate successful and sustainable adaptation? And so to adapt to change, we need to foster an individual or a system's capacity to adapt. So it's adaptive capacity. And I'm sure you've heard the term adaptive capacity tossed around, but what exactly does it mean? And if you're wondering what it means, I suggest you talk to Abigail Golden here, but I'll do a quick overview just for the purposes of the talk. So it has multiple components. Broadly, adaptive capacity is the capacity of a system to absorb stresses and maintain function in the face of change, and to adapt, reorganize, and change in ways that improve the sustainability of a system, making it better prepared for future change. And so a system can adapt to change in many ways. At the simplest level, it can just cope with change and try to persist as it is. Or it can adapt over time to a new normal, as this poor bird is doing, trying to find a high place to perch in an industrial landscape. Or a system can dramatically transform in the face of change by taking advantage of new opportunities. And if a system does cope, adapt, or transform, the hope is that these changes yield a desirable future state, both socially and ecologically. So there's acknowledgement that adaptive capacity is critical in the face of climate change. However, it's challenging to measure or develop, given that adaptive capacity is a property of an entire system. So you can't just insert some adaptive capacity here and it works. It's actually a property of the system itself. Indicators to measure and assess adaptive capacity vary based on context, and they're not easily reduced to a single numerical index or metric. And adaptive capacity, or lack thereof, is generally only revealed when the system is challenged by change. So it's hard to look at a system and understand what its capacity to adapt is until it's undergone some sort of stressor or change and shown whether or not it's capable of adapting. However, there's a vast academic literature on factors theorized to enhance adaptive capacity. So what supports adaptive capacity? At the individual or institutional level, many scholars discuss having access to different forms of capital. So natural capital, human capital, social, financial, physical capital, as supporting the ability to adapt to change. And so from a fisheries perspective, having access to, say, a large boat or a form of physical capital would allow you to travel farther if needed to catch, stocks as they move farther offshore, move north, move south, or having a skilled and knowledgeable crew might enable adaptation to different species or to shift to, to engage in different types of fishing. So that would be a form of social or human capital, or at an institutional level, having access to financial reserves might allow you to invest in strategies to adapt to change. So these are all ways of looking at, sorry, I'm going on screen here. These are all ways of looking at adaptive capacity that, are the way people looked at it in the early days and are potentially not always satisfying and not always complete to some people. So what these types of capital is in some ways taking very complex concepts and complicated concepts and reducing it to primarily an economic lens through which to view things. So thinking of, my crew as a form of human capital is not necessarily appealing to people, and it doesn't get at all of the complex nuances of what it means to have adaptive capacity. So more recently, scholars have looked at different forms of adaptive capacity as having strengths in multiple different domains. And so one of these domains is considered to be assets. So assets is really, in some ways, the different forms of capital on the previous slide can be considered to fall within this domain. So access to different forms of capital is critical to coping and developing and investing in new adaptive strategies. Having flexibility is also critical to adaptive capacity. So flexibility in resource harvesting and timing and in systems, economic flexibility, and regulatory flexibility, which can allow people to experiment by changing what types of behaviors are allowed. It can allow people to adapt. Social organization is another domain of adaptive capacity that can facilitate or inhibit cooperation, collective action, and knowledge sharing. And it's really made up of how society is organized at the individual level, as communities or as institutions. And it's also composed of relationships, networks, trust, and social cohesion, things that are really critical to how a society functions, but can sometimes be hard to measure. Learning is also considered an important aspect of adaptive capacity. So generating, absorbing, and processing new information about climate change, learning about adaptation options and how to better live with change. And agency, which is an important concept, but one that people often struggle to understand or explain. By agency, I don't mean a government agency, although a government agency can have agency. But in terms of a domain of adaptive capacity, it really means having the power and freedom to mobilize these other domains of adaptive capacity to actively shape the future. And it depends on people's belief in their own ability to effectively act in response to change. And then more recently, at least in the literature, there's another added domain, which is sociocognitive constructs. And this is the idea that you're not going to respond, you're not going to take action to adapt to change unless you acknowledge the need to adapt. So it's the influence of perceptions regarding the need to adapt to change or not, and the costs or benefits of adaptation. So if you are, say, living in the state of Florida, where you're not allowed to talk about climate change in the government, it can really limit your acknowledgement of the need to change. Or as I was talking over breakfast with some graduate students, in a context where I used to work in coastal Tanzania, I talked to some fishermen who told me that they believed that fish came from God from the sky when they rained in from the clouds. And so no action that they took would actually affect the number of fish in the sea. So if your sociocognitive construct means that the number of fish in the sea has nothing to do with your fishing behavior, you're unlikely to alter your fishing behavior to try to, sustain fish. So these characteristics have all been theorized to support adaptive capacity. They're all interlinked and important. They're also all very abstract. And as much as I'm sure I enjoy, and you guys are enjoying wallowing in social theory with me here, sometimes it can be a little easier to understand if you attach it to more tangible concepts. So, so how can we actually understand adaptive capacity of an actual fishery system in the face of climate change? And from a management perspective, what are the characteristics of a system that facilitate or hinder adaptive capacity? And are there actions that can be taken that enhance a system's capacity to adapt to change, or to adapt, cope, or transform to a desirable new state in the face of change? And, honestly, I don't know the best way to answer these questions, but I'm involved in a lot of projects right now that are trying to get at these broader questions from multiple perspectives. And as a social scientist, I've found that getting answers to questions from people works a lot better when you can draw on their lived experience or actual tangible examples. And so the project I'm going to talk about today is where we took the approach of using people's responses to change in the past to better understand and predict their capacity to adapt to future change, looking at the squid and lobster fishery, which I'll talk about in a bit. And so, we know that ocean temperatures have been increasing gradually over time, but daily, monthly, and yearly ocean conditions are highly variable, requiring fishermen to constantly be adapting to changing conditions, regardless of overall directional climate change. And on the west coast of the US, changes in coastal upwelling associated with the El Nino Southern Oscillation means that fishermen have already experienced adapting to warmer waters during cyclic El Nino events, and adapting to cooler waters during La Nina events. So given fishermen's experience with these types of cyclic changes and changes in the past, we took the approach that first, we could use fishermen's responses to historic El Nino events in the past as a proxy to predict their capacity to adapt to future warming ocean conditions. And then second, since fishermen are already adapting to change, speaking directly with fishermen about what has inhibited their adaptive capacity in the face of both past and potential future change can better inform our understanding of the adaptive capacity in these fisheries. And we chose to focus on two fisheries in the study. We looked at the California market squid and the California spiny lobster fisheries, which are two of the highest value fisheries in the state of California and are both managed by the state of California, although market squid is part of the coastal pelagic system. So falls somewhat under NOAA, but technically managed by California. And these fisheries have very different ecological and social characteristics. Market squid tends to spawn, well, it does spawn in colder waters that are typical of La Nina conditions. And when I mean colder waters, I mean like coastal California colder waters, not cold waters like you have up here. So actually warm water still. But when the water cools, say in more La Nina type conditions, that's when spawning tends to be the strongest. They have a fairly wide species range. It's mostly from San Diego to Monterey, but can vary both north and south of that. And the fishery is characterized by very large, highly mobile vessels. Spiny lobster, on the other hand, has a much more concentrated range, at least in the US. The US fishery is primarily in the California Bight, and I don't have a map up here, but the northern limit is Point Conception, so it's sort of San Diego to Santa Barbara area. I'll have a map later. And so it's primarily a California Bight and Mexican fishery. It's also into Mexico. The lobster tend to be more active and grow more quickly in warmer waters, typical of El Nino events. The boats for fishing lobster tend to be smaller and less mobile, and it's a highly territorial fishery. So while fishermen are allowed to fish pretty much anywhere, fishermen have their territories which are socially regulated. And so while you can fish outside of your typical traditional area, if you do, you're doing so at your own risk, because you'll have a lot of fishermen who are not happy with you and may, cut your lines or something like that. So people tend not to move a lot. So we took two approaches to collecting data for this project. So it's a mixed method type of approach. First, we looked to see how fishermen have responded to climate variation over time using catch records, looking to see how these correlated with historic indicators of climate variation in the region, primarily looking at strong El Nino and La Nina events. So we got secondary catch data from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, looking at location, depth for lobster, either legals retain or total catch weight. And we tried to look at differences in catch and catch location correlated with the oceanic Nino index. So looking at strong El Nino events versus strong La Nina events for each species. Second, we spoke directly with fishermen to try to understand what factors, how they changed their behavior based on these events and what factors facilitated or inhibited their ability to adapt to these changing conditions. So we did interviews with both lobster fishermen and squid fishermen between 2017 and 2019. We got those done just before COVID, lucky us, and asked questions related to fishermen's behavior, constraints on adaptation, demographic characteristics, other things like that. We also, after we collected our preliminary data, both from the catch records and interviews and did some preliminary analysis, we presented these results back to fishermen in feedback sessions to get their perspective on the validity of our results, if this reflected their lived experience, and also to get their input on additional questions that came up based on the answers to the interviews. The interviews were more like, technically they were surveys with a lot of semi-structured interview questions embedded in. So they took 45 minutes to an hour to complete. I want to make one note, particularly because it just came up from a reviewer on a paper. I use the term fisherman. We didn't speak exclusively with men. We did speak with, the fishery is largely composed of men, but there are a few women in the fishery, and we did speak with one female lobster person who fished lobster and a woman who fished for squid. And both of these people expressed a preference to be referred to as fishermen versus the gender neutral fishers or as fisherwomen or something like that. So we are honoring their perspective or their preference by using the general term fisherman. I also want to acknowledge I was the PI on this project, but none of this could have happened and I could not be giving this presentation without help from my amazing research assistant, Lucia Ordonez-Gager, who conducted the majority of interviews with fishermen and who is really amazing at getting fishermen to talk to her. As you can see from our sample size, we had 59% of permit holders for lobster and 48% of vessels for squid, which is remarkably good. And also Farah Powell, a PhD student who works with me, did the majority of spatial data analysis for catch records, did qualitative coding of the interviews, and did a lot of the survey analysis. So, so their input was crucial. All right. So here's our findings. So from the catch data, we found that the squid fishery is dramatically different during El Nino versus La Nina events, with El Nino just being bad news for the fishery. So here you can see the green bars are the mean, the total cumulative catch averaged across all strong El Nino versus all strong La Nina events. And you can see that cumulative total catch in general is much lower during El Nino events than La Nina events when it's much higher. And the timing of catch is also different in these events. So during warm El Nino years in the red, the majority of catch occurs in the northern range of the fishery, where spawning typically occurs during the spring and summer. And then during cool La Nina years, which is in blue, you see the opposite trend with the majority of squid caught during the fall and winter, during fall and winter in the southern part of the fishery. And fishermen respond to these different conditions by changing where they fish. And so the maps here show fishermen's responses during the interviews, asking where they concentrated their fishing during El Nino events, during La Nina events, and during kind of normal, not either extreme fishing events. And you can see that while fishermen tend to concentrate their fishing efforts in the south during normal and La Nina events, during the warm El Nino events, fishermen said they fished much farther north, even, I don't think it really shows here, but I guess a little bit, even up into Oregon during recent years. And now the state of Oregon is actually in the process of determining how to regulate the emerging squid fishery that's happening up there. And then our catch data corroborates what fishermen said about changing where they fish. This map shows the change in percent catch by fishing block. And you can see during strong El Nino events, when the water's warmer, fishing is concentrated farther north into the Monterey area, and sometimes into the San Francisco Bay, or even into Oregon, which is not on here because it's just California data. And so you see the same kind of variation in where they fish during different types of events. Now for lobster, we took a similar approach to data analysis, and we found that in terms of longitude and latitude, there was actually very little change over time, either from the interviews with fishermen or from the catch data. So I'm not actually showing that map because it's not very interesting. And this is likely because lobster fishermen are much more mobility constrained. They have smaller boats. It's a very territorial fishery. You also don't typically find lobster north of Point Conception, so they don't usually go outside the California Bight, and then they're not allowed to go south into Mexico, and so they're pretty constrained in where they can fish. But when we talk to fishermen about how they adapted to change, a lot of them mentioned that during El Nino events, they tended to set their traps much deeper. They were finding the lobster at much deep, like tremendously deeper depths than they were during normal or La Nina conditions. And so we did look at the catch records to see what they showed in terms of depth. And you can see here that during strong El Nino events, lobster fishermen are setting their traps and catching a lot deeper. And over time, I'm not showing that, but over time, it seems that they have been setting their traps deeper and deeper as El Nino events happen, in part maybe from experience learning that this is a successful strategy in adapting to El Nino events. Pardon me. So you can see squid fishermen are already highly adaptable, in part based on their large mobile vessels. They have a lot of flexibility based on this vessels and mobile gear, and also are able to be flexible in terms of timing. They're showing, they also showed flexibility in terms of learning and innovation. During the time of our interviews, one of the major constraints on fishing in the north was infrastructure. There was just a shortage of infrastructure to land squid, really north of Monterey. But by the time we did our feedback sessions, fishermen had already gotten beyond that, where they said they were starting to use mobile pumps and were able to offload squid much farther north. So as they adapted to change, as El Nino events were happening, they learned different ways of being able to shift where they fished and how they could offload their fish or offload their squid. They also expressed tremendous agency in terms of most fishermen said that they were willing to chase the squid anywhere. So no matter how far they went, they didn't see that as an obstacle. The lobster fishery, you also see flexibility in terms of the depth. People started to realize that if they set their traps deeper, they would have more success rate in catching. And so they could set based on conditions, could set them deeper or shallower, also learning and innovation in that way. And we also saw an impact on assets in terms of their ability to adapt. So we found that fishermen who had higher income and larger boats expressed more confidence in their ability to adapt to possible change than fishermen with lower income and smaller boats. We also asked fishermen about factors that might constrain their capacity to adapt to change. And most fishermen, particularly squid fishermen, which is the yellow bars, saw themselves as able to adapt their own individual behavior to almost any future climate condition, particularly given that they're adapting all the time from year to year. Mobility and knowledge of other locations were considered probably the primary individual level constraints that people faced, but this was really more of a constraint, of a perceived constraint for lobster fishermen than squid fishermen. And as I said previously, people with larger boats or higher incomes didn't see it as much of a constraint as those with smaller boats and lower incomes. Also, knowledge of other fisheries was not something that people can perceive as a constraint. Most fishermen in general were very confident in their ability to adapt to change and to switch to another fishery if allowed to do so. The challenge, though, is that given the current regulatory environment in California and the US, it's very hard to fish to another species and to make a variety of changes. And so most fishermen really saw the biggest constraints to their adaptive capacity as being institutional and government types constraints on the left. And particularly, they cited regulatory inflexibility and an inability to get fishing permits given their high cost and lack of availability, which limits their flexibility to switch species during periods when some species weren't abundant. They also cited marine protected areas as constraining where they could fish, and low quota in many fisheries is making their existing permits worthless. And now these are all very important regulators, like having, permits and quota and marine protected areas are all critical regulatory tools to maintaining sustainable fisheries, and have been very successful in the US and in California in keeping our fishery system sustainable. But they also do constrain fishermen's capacity to adapt. In the squid fishery, this regulatory inflexibility combined with the depletion of complementary fisheries that had allowed fishermen to diversify their catch in the past puts increased pressure on fishermen and fishery resources. So, for example, squid fishermen historically used to shift effort among coastal pelagic species, coastal pelagic finfish species, in response to fluctuations in squid availability or demand, as these species have overlapping gear types, ranges, and types of boats that you use. But because these, particularly the squid fishery, has been closed since, I believe, 2015, and there's been reductions in quotas in other CPS fisheries, it's really put a lot of pressure on squid fishermen. So one guy, expressed this frustration by saying, it's dangerous to have all your eggs in one basket. We've always had another fishery to move to, and sardine helped us stay afloat. Now there's nothing else you can do. And then another fisherman said, I was involved in many fisheries, but it's all gone to hell. I can't make any money. Salmon's not very good. Sardines closed. We're getting squeezed and having to spend more time in squid. And so they saw this as a big frustration, particularly in that they become more dependent on squid, less flexible economically, but then they're also, because this is the only species that they can fish, that they're putting more pressure on this resource. And these issues get to a common theme that I've found in all of the projects I'm involved in that explore the adaptive capacity of coastal and ocean systems. And Abigail has even led a paper on this theme, which I suggest everybody read, which is how do you balance the need for rigid regulatory structures to ensure sustainable natural resource management with the need for flexibility in the face of a changing climate? And interestingly, while fishermen cited rigid regulatory constraint and governance constraints as the primary factors that were constraining their own capacity to adapt, they're extremely supportive of the regulations in their respective fisheries. And I don't know how many of you spend time talking to fishermen, but if you do, fishermen actually really like to complain about regulations. So I was a little surprised that these results were so positive, but we found that most fishermen strongly believe in the need for fisheries regulations to ensure the long-term sustainability of the resource. And I'm showing the squid fishermen support for fishery regulations here, and I can show you lobster later if you want, but we found in both fisheries, fishermen expressed either support or were somewhat supportive of all of the relevant regulations within their fisheries. And for fishermen who were either somewhat supportive or not supportive, a lot of it was because they either wanted the regulations to be stronger or they wanted some sort of flexibility in the regulation to match their lived experience fishing the species. So how do we create flexibility while also maintaining effective regulations under a changing climate? And unfortunately, I don't actually have the answer to this question. And I don't think that fishermen have all the answers, but I do think that talking to fishermen can expand our understanding of the outcomes of regulatory policy. And during our interviews, fishermen had a lot of ideas about how to strengthen regulations while also making them more flexible. And so I thought I would share a few here. A common concern among the fishermen was the impacts of destructive gear. And so having stricter gear regulations to protect habitat was something that came up extremely frequently with the squid fishermen, particularly in terms of the harmful effects of cable purse line. So this one here, if you can probably see it, I usually hate when people read quotes, but here I am doing it. One squid fisherman said, we need to ban cable purse and require rib line. The recent increase in fishery pressure is hard on the fish. We need some management. Methods like cable pursing means setting nets hundreds of times in the same spot, basically sterilizing the bottom. We need net size limits on length and depth. Another common theme that came up was rethinking seasons and quota based on observed biological patterns and processes. And so this was also common in the squid fishery, where the season for the squid fishery is actually all year. There's not really a season, it's just year round. But the season resets, I think it's in April every year. And the quota is quite high and is usually not met, but when it is met, then it shuts down the fishery. And the squid fishermen thought some of these things needed to be rethought. They said we should probably have seasonal closures during the slow season. This keeps a fair fishery, lets things breathe and recuperate. Also, there's less fuel burn. Searching all around for the last scraps of quota is wasteful, not productive, and costly. Put these out of order, but I'll skip down to the bottom where it's another squid fisherman. There could be a better quota system with in-season adjustments. It's crazy to say we should stop fishing in the years where there's an amazing abundance of squid. It's better to spread out the catch. If everything's caught before it spawns, it's not good for the resource to take everything at once, which is what the quota does. Fast as you can, however you can. It's good for the money, but it's not good for the longevity of the resource. So a lot of people thought that this, stationary quota didn't make sense given the extremely dynamic population, or the extremely kind of booms and busts population cycle of squid in some years where they would never meet, they couldn't meet the quota because there just weren't enough squid, and in other years where they'd meet it quite quickly. But they didn't think they were actually having a negative impact on the resource if they were to continue to fish. And then for lobster, one of the things people were noticing was particularly in warm years, but overall they've seen a shifting in biological patterns based on climate change. So one guy said, think of the middle one, things have shifted because of climate change. Everything like molt and breeding has shifted 2 months early. So I keep catching impregnated females at the end of the season, which hurts the resource. So he wanted, based on at least the patterns that he was seeing, a reassessment of the season to see if it might make sense to shift it. And then last one here, common theme that came up with both was effectively enforcing existing regulations for sustainability. So lobster fishermen said our biggest problem is fishing game's lack of manpower to enforce their regulations. All of the veteran guys are very frustrated with the lack of enforcement and low fines and penalties for taking ashore. We need stronger penalties to incentivize compliance. So even the existing rules were fine, but they just weren't being enforced. All right. So what does this all mean? Honestly, I'm trying to figure out how to address these questions myself. But we can see that fishermen are already adapting to change. Fisheries are dynamic systems, and many fishermen already exhibit highly adaptable behavior. Both the catch data and the self-reporting from fishermen shows clear shifts in response to warm El Nino events and adaptation over time, which can inform fisheries management and management needs moving forward. If we think we're going to be seeing conditions more like that in the future, then maybe we can use the way that people have adapted and responded in the past to inform what management might need to look like in the future. While fishermen are already very adaptable, so far institutional and governance structures haven't been quite as adaptive. And so while it's important to fishery sustainability, the inflexibility of current regulatory systems aren't really well suited to rapid climate adaptation. And in many cases, we found that fishermen, when they weren't happy with the regulations, they actually said they wanted stronger regulations to protect stocks, but they also wanted increased flexibility in some of the regulatory processes to respond to change. And overall, a theme that we heard over and over from fishermen was that increasing fishermen's participation in management and building trust are really key to improving management systems and fishermen's perceived capacity to adapt to change. And the lack of communication between fisheries managers, fisheries biologists, and fishermen themselves was something that came up as a frustration amongst fishermen across our interviews. All right, so that's what I've got. If you're interested and you'd like to read more, I put up references for several papers that are out of this research project on these different topics. I also put Abigail's in because I think everyone should read it, and it really gets to this conflict between regulatory rigidity and the need for flexibility under climate change. I also want to acknowledge the funding for this project came from the NSF Coastal Seas Collaborative Research Program, which is a program that sadly no longer exists, but it was great when it did. And then also want to thank the students, collaborators, and all of the fishermen who took the time to speak with us. And thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer. Mhm.
Just two questions that are kind of general. Can you provide some commentary on how you think differ with respect to kind of maybe generational demographics in the fishery we talked to, and then also they ever mention any interactions with recreational fisheries, whether directly with Squid or with the neighboring ones?
Yeah, okay, so generational differences, overall, fishermen, at least that we talk to, tend to be an older demographic. But I'm trying to recall what the differences are for the younger ones. I think the older people were more able to talk about change over time. They also seem to have more frustration with regulatory processes. I think a lot of regulations were set up to some degree under different climatic systems. And so as systems are changing and the regulations aren't, they've observed a change over time that regulations aren't responding to. So that would be something I'd say I think exists, because I don't think we had enough young guys in our sample. I think it'd be hard to systematically say there was a difference between older and younger people, but I did get that a bit from them. What was your second question? Sorry. Recreational, yeah, okay, yeah. That came up a lot with the lobster fishermen, especially. Yeah, and I didn't talk about it, but they are very, very, very passionate about it. The recreational lobster fishery in California, the data collection for that is very, it's a little ad hoc. There is a data collection system, but it's voluntary reporting. And so at least among the commercial guys, there's a lot of belief that the recreational fishery is actually having a large impact on the total fishery, but it's not being monitored. And so there is a lot of frustration about that. And also about what many people see is like I don't know if you call it like a code of ethics, but that they feel like some of the recreational fishermen don't follow the same codes for sustainability that they would. They also believe that they're allowed to, or have observed that they're allowed to fish in places that commercial guys aren't supposed to go, which they see as problematic. So we didn't actually talk to any recreational fishermen in either fishery. There's not a lot of recreational. I think there's some like bait squid fishing. There's not a lot of recreational squid that I'm aware of. There's a lot of recreational lobster, but we didn't target that group in part because it's a very hard group to target. People, they do their voluntary reporting. I think they have to have a permit, but it's harder to get at that group. So I wish I could say more, but I know there are a lot of strong feelings about it.
Do you know if any of these fishers are engaged with policymakers? Are they talking about insight? Yeah, a lot of fishermen referred to some public engagement processes that went on, particularly during the MLPA process in California. So the implementation of the Marine Protected Area system in California, there was a very concerted effort to reach out to fishermen to get their input on where MPAs should be placed in order to, I guess fishermen were told to minimize the impact to the fishery. And I didn't put up I think I have it somewhere here. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I didn't put up the slide about lobster fishermen perceptions of management, but you can see here this, the third from the left, MPAs is where you see the least level of support. There's a lot of support with caveats, but there's a lot of do not support. And so this one was extremely controversial. A lot of it was because lobster fishermen, there are many reasons. A lot of it was because they believed that their input wasn't really taken seriously. So a lot of them said, we were asked to come to meetings. We told them where not to put the MPAs, and that's exactly where they put the MPAs. And so that doesn't do a lot to build trust. There was also a lot of people had the impression that the Marine Protected Area network would be rotating, or it would be like closures and then opening later. And I don't know exactly, I reached out to people involved in the process, and they said that was never the impression that they thought they gave, but there were enough fishermen who said that I think at some level they were getting told this. And so because the MPAs are actually permanent, a lot of people were upset about that. So they're like, what's the point of setting us away and like building up a stock if none of us can access it? I think there's also a problem in science communication around particularly the MPAs, because a lot of people were talking about how, you know, lobsters never leave, they just stay in there and then just getting these huge lobsters that nobody can catch. And that there's no spillover effects, but there has been research that's showing actually like the fishing blocks right outside MPAs actually tend to have very, very high catch. There is, you know, a question like they're saying if they fish there, they don't get that much. There's also a lot of kind of compaction around the MPAs. So there's a lot of fishing pressure just there. So it may be that, you know, per capita lobster fish catch is not that high, but total is very high. But I think the science behind MPAs and their effect and that it may be having some spillover benefits to fisheries could be better communicated, but it's not being well communicated. There are some fishermen who've been involved in kind of, I guess, cooperative type research. And that actually, I think, did feed into some support for some measures and some better understanding of the science, but that wasn't a large majority of the fishermen, it was just a few of them. So there have been efforts to involve people in policy, but the policy processes we have right now are not usually great. It usually gets people's input and involvement once we know something needs to happen. So, okay, we're going to put in MPAs, now tell us how this is going to impact you, as opposed to, you know, earlier in the process when they're thinking about our MPAs the right tool, how could we do this? What would be the best way to approach it? So yes, people are engaged, but it hasn't necessarily been in a way that's made them very supportive.
Following on the same theme, there was a paper that came out last year on whether the MPAs have contributed to climate resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically concluded no.
Yeah. Yep.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I found that to be a very interesting paper and kind of a sad paper, because that was one of the things they were theorizing, oh, this can help, you know, support resilience in lots of ways. And then they found, no, they're not actually contributing to climate resilience. We didn't really talk about that with fishermen. So I can't really comment on that. But if that science was communicated to fishermen, it probably wouldn't help in terms of their support for MPAs. I think, you know, there's aspects of the science that I think could help with support. I think there's other things that might not. But MPAs were consistently the most controversial topic that we talk to people about, less so for squid than for lobster. But even squid fishermen, a lot of the frustration was not necessarily about the MPAs themselves. A lot of them were supportive, but they thought that the regulations around MPAs were too strict, and that they were just frustrated that even if they drifted into an MPA and they hadn't put away all their gear, they could be fined even if they weren't fishing. And so that was something that they said really constrained their ability to fish even in the proximity of an MPA, because they had to make sure everything was, you know, taken up before they drifted into MPA territory. So that was really the frustration we saw there. Mm-hmm.
Any feeling for whether stocks that are subject to allocation conflicts have less adaptive capacity? And if so, is there a way to track that net?
Yeah, we have another project that's looking kind of at that. That has nothing to do with these species. Yeah, for these, none of them are subject to allocation conflicts. They're both California and Mexico, but there's not an allocation thing between California and Mexico for these species. It is something I think is worth trying to get into before it becomes a big fishery in Oregon for the squid, at least. But so far they're just figuring out what to do with it. It's such a new fishery. In terms of stocked with allocation conflicts, yes, that presents a whole lot of new challenges, because then you have, you know, the allocation of quota is going to need to shift as stocks shift. And there's going to need to be winners and losers. And so how do you negotiate that? How do you negotiate people giving up their entrenched interest and giving people new quota as it's moving into their area in a way that is fair and equitable and makes sense? And are there ways of compensating fishermen for loss if needed? And I think we still haven't really gotten there yet. The other thing to keep in mind, and it's an issue here too, is that, you know, if people lose access to their permit, for a lot of these fishermen, their fishing permits, their retirement. especially like in squid, these are very high value fisheries. And when you sell off your permit, you get a lot of money. And so a lot of them are viewing this as like, I've invested in my retirement by holding on to this permit. And my income from squid varies year to year. It's not necessarily, some years it's great, other years it's not great, but I know when I retire, I can sell my permit and I'll be okay. If they suddenly lose access to that because of reallocation, that can be a big problem. And that's something on the East Coast where they're discussing reallocation issues, has been something that I think is a big source of stress and resistance of like, I've been investing in this. The other thing is like, I talk about fisheries being a very dynamic system, and year to year, you don't know exactly what it's going to be like. Ocean conditions change, abundance of fish changes. And for some of these fishermen, the one thing that has been stable actually is regulatory policy. And so the one thing they can count on is these are the regulations and this is my quota, and and I know I'm safe. And so the thought of that also becoming dynamic, I think makes some fishermen nervous. Or is my interpretation of it, but I don't have an answer yet for stock allocation. Someday maybe, but
Do you think there's any bias in the data you found, given that it came from fishermen that responded to your inputs?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There may be. I feel like the questions we were asking them weren't necessarily something where they would have a motivation to lie. Like if we were saying, we're going to put in an MPA, tell me where you fish. They're going to be trying to game it. They're like, okay, well, do I tell them where I fish because then she's going to take it away from me? Or do I tell her where I fish because then she's not going to put an MPA there? Yeah, we were really asking about, where have you fished in the past under different conditions, and what makes you more able to adapt to change? What are obstacles that get in the way of you changing? And so from my impression of talking to them, it didn't seem like they really saw us as having a motivation here. And we're a university, so we weren't like a government organization that they'd be more, suspicious of. We did ask a lot of perceptions of management, and for the most part, people let us know what they thought. So I don't feel like in this case, I was overly concerned about bias. There was something that we, thought about, which was, not all these fishermen believe in directional climate change. And so we were very careful not to necessarily frame it as, how are you going to adapt in the face of future human-induced climate change? We did have a question that asked people, I think, about their understanding of climate change. And one of the options was, I don't acknowledge human-induced climate change. And so we did get from people whether or not they thought this was actually even a thing. But we kept it really more like, let's look at people's lived experience. Nobody denied the existence of El Nino events, or that oceans were changing over time. And so people talked about how they responded in the past to that. But there could be some sort of, bias or difference in the data. I do think in terms of sampling, it was much harder for us to get squid fishermen based in Monterey. And there was a lot of talk about the Monterey fishery as being kind of a family mafia kind of group. And so I do think we got some guys from Monterey, but we didn't get as many as I would have liked. So I do think we are missing that perspective in our data.
What do you think the interest or incentive fishermen have to participate in the study? Like, what do they want to do?
Why would they even talk to us?
Yes.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and I think we didn't give them any kind of like incentive. We didn't give them a cash incentive to talk to us. Yeah, it was really, I think they seemed receptive to it. I think I think some of them are curious about what's going to happen in the face of climate change. I think part of it is that the first people that we interviewed were either people that I knew, people that I had networks with, or could get referred to by somebody that I already had a relationship with. The other people we talked to, we did a lot. I mean, we had a list, we eventually got a list of like all registered fishermen or vessels. But most of our sampling was done with a snowball approach, which is like you talk to a fisherman and then ask, can you recommend anyone else I could talk to? And then, they recommend 5 people and give you their contact information, and then you talk to them. And so it helped that we would talk to people who would then recommend other people, and we could reach out to them and say, so-and-so recommended that I talk to you, and they could call their friend and say, hey, what's this about? And then they would say, oh yeah, they're fine, go ahead and talk to them. I actually had a nice time chatting with them. I think it helps that Lucia, our primary interviewer, is just an amazingly nice person and has a way with people that, you know, she listens with respect and understanding, and I think people just, they felt like their opinion was really being heard. They got an opportunity to rant about regulations if they want, which I think people enjoy. But I was shocked by what a good response rate we had. Like, I didn't actually expect it to be as high as it was, but I think it must be a topic that people are thinking about, because we did have an amazing response rate. And I did hear, like, you know, people would call their friends and say, you know, what is this project? Who is this person talking to me? And they'd say, oh no, they're fine, you can talk to them. You know, I did worry about that biasing our sample a little bit, because snowball sampling can definitely get you in a certain group of people, but we really tried very hard to reach out, you know, to individuals that we found in different areas and different kind of networks of fishermen, to make sure that we got as diverse of the sample as possible. And after we got through all the snowball sampling, we started just cold calling people from the Department of Fish and Wildlife list, which was harder, but we did get a lot of people that way too. But yeah, I mean, for other projects I've been involved in, you know, we've given out incentives to talk to us, or we have, you know, there's other reasons they might be interested in being engaged. This one, I was surprised how many people were willing to talk to us, but I think it must be a topic that they're interested in, because we had such a high response rate, and a very nice interviewer.
All right, we have a reception outside, and let's thank Arielle one more time.
Thank